I've never told this story publicly because it still feels unfinished, like something that didn't end properly. I'm sharing it now because enough time has passed that I can talk about it without my hands shaking, and because what happened at that lake wasn't just scary in the moment, it followed me home. It still does. This happened during the summer after my junior year of college when I was 21. I grew up in a small town in northern Michigan, the kind of place surrounded by woods and water where everyone has a story about a lake they don't swim in anymore. Back then, I didn't believe those stories. I thought they were excuses made by people who scared easily. There was a lake about 40 minutes from town called Alder Lake. It wasn't on any tourist map, just a long stretch of dark water tucked behind miles of Forest Service roads. No cabins, no docks, no lifeguards, just water and trees. My friend Eric knew about it because his uncle used to fish there years ago. One Friday night in late July, after a long week of heat and boredom, Eric suggested we drive out there and camp. Just one night. No phones, no distractions. I remember hesitating for a second, not because I was scared, but because something about the idea felt heavy. I ignored that feeling, like I always did back then. We left around 6 p.m., just the two of us in his old pickup, windows down, music low. The farther we drove, the worse the road got. Pavement turned to gravel. Gravel turned to dirt. By the time we reached the clearing near the lake, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. The place looked exactly how you'd expect. Still, quiet, and untouched. The lake was longer than it was wide, with water so dark it reflected the sky like black glass. No bugs, no birds, no sound except the wind through the trees. That should have been my first warning. We set up our tent near the tree line, a good distance from the water. Eric joked about how creepy it felt, but he was smiling, trying to keep things light. We made a small fire, cooked some food, and talked about nothing important. As it got darker, the lake seemed to swallow the last bit of light. The surface didn't ripple, not even once. Around 10 p.m., Eric dared me to go swimming. I laughed it off at first, but after a while, with the fire crackling and the night feeling strangely empty, I agreed. We stripped down to our shorts and walked toward the water with a flashlight. The beam barely cut through the darkness. The shoreline dropped off faster than I expected. Within a few steps, the water was already waist-deep and freezing cold. Eric went in first, splashing, trying to make it feel normal. I followed, my chest tight for no reason I could explain. We swam out maybe 20 feet, then stopped. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. No frogs, no insects. Even our splashing sounded muted, like the lake was absorbing the noise. Eric joked again, but his voice sounded off, like it didn't belong there. Then I felt something brush against my leg. Not weeds, not a fish. It felt deliberate, slow, like fingers dragging across my calf. I froze. I didn't say anything at first because I didn't want to sound stupid. Then Eric stopped moving too. He whispered my name and asked if I felt that. Before I could answer, something pulled hard on my ankle, yanking me under. I went down fast, water rushing into my nose and mouth. I kicked and thrashed, expecting to feel weeds or rocks, but there was nothing solid, just pressure. Hands. I know how that sounds, but that's the only way I can describe it. Hands gripping and releasing, like they couldn't quite hold on. I broke the surface screaming. Eric was already swimming backward toward shore, his face pale in the flashlight beam. We didn't talk, we didn't joke. We just ran back to the fire, grabbed our clothes, and threw them on with shaking hands. Eric wanted to leave right then, but it was late, and the road back was narrow and unlit. I told him we were probably just panicking. That lakes do weird things to your head at night. Even as I said it, I didn't believe myself. We decided to stay in the tent and leave at first light. Neither of us slept. Every few minutes I heard something near the water. Slow splashes, not random. Rhythmic, like someone wading back and forth. Eric heard it too. He kept whispering that someone must be messing with us, but we both knew that was impossible. No headlights, no footsteps, no voices, just water moving where there shouldn't have been movement. Sometime after midnight, the splashing stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I don't know how long passed before I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like damp metal. Then it got stronger, seeping into the tent. Eric gagged and said it smelled like blood. I zipped the tent open just an inch and shined the flashlight toward the lake. What I saw still shows up in my dreams. The water near the shore was no longer smooth. It was rippling outward from a single point, like something was standing just beneath the surface. Then the water bulged upward, slow and heavy, as if whatever was under there was trying to rise but couldn't fully break through. I saw a shape, darker than the water itself, with what looked like shoulders just under the surface. Then it sank back down, and the lake went still again. We didn't wait for morning. We packed up in silence, hands shaking so badly it took us twice as long. As we drove away, I looked back once through the rear window. At the edge of the clearing, right where the trees met the water, something was standing. Tall, motionless, watching us leave. Eric said he didn't see it. I didn't argue. We made it back to town just before sunrise. We didn't talk about the lake again. Not for years. Eric moved out of state. I stayed. I tried to forget. I almost succeeded. Until last fall, when a local news article popped up on my phone. A teenager had gone missing while swimming in Alder Lake. Search crews found his clothes on the shore. They never found his body. The article mentioned something else, too. Older fishermen claimed the lake had a history. People who drowned there were said to never leave. The water didn't give them back. I don't go near lakes anymore, even shallow ones, even crowded beaches. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I hear water moving where it shouldn't. Slow, patient, like something waiting for me to come back. I'm not sure why I'm writing this now, years later, except that the older I get, the harder it is to pretend it didn't happen. I've told myself every logical explanation you can think of, and none of them sit right. This happened when I was 24, during the first summer after I moved to Oregon for work. I didn't know many people yet, and on weekends I spent most of my time driving, just exploring, killing time. That's how I found Hollow Creek Lake. It wasn't marked on Google Maps, just a faded wooden sign off a 2-lane highway that read Hollow Creek Reservoir, 2 miles. I almost didn't turn. Something about the name felt wrong, like it was warning me instead of welcoming me. I turned anyway. The road narrowed quickly, surrounded by dense pine forest. No houses, no campsites, no cell service. When I reached the lake, it looked peaceful in a dull, unsettling way. The water was pale gray, reflecting the overcast sky, and the shoreline was uneven, littered with dead branches and old fishing lines. There was one other car in the lot, an older sedan with fogged windows, but no one around it. I figured someone was already out fishing. I walked down to the water with a backpack and a folding chair, planning to sit for a while and then head back before dark. That was the plan. The lake didn't sound like a lake should. The water moved, but it didn't lap against the shore. It just shifted, quietly, like it was breathing. I sat there for maybe an hour, skipping rocks, scrolling on my phone whenever I could get a weak signal. That's when I noticed ripples forming far out in the middle of the lake. They weren't spreading outward like something had splashed. They were converging, slowly pulling inward toward one spot. I watched them for a long time, waiting for a fish to jump or something to surface. Nothing did. The ripples stopped all at once. The water flattened, smooth as glass. I remember feeling embarrassed for being unsettled by something so small. I stood up and decided to walk along the shoreline before leaving. About 10 minutes into the walk, I found a dock. It looked old but solid, extending maybe 30 feet into the lake. At the end of it sat a man, facing away from me, feet dangling just above the water. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, which struck me as odd given the mild weather. I cleared my throat and said hello. He didn't respond. I assumed he hadn't heard me and walked closer, my footsteps loud on the wooden planks. When I was about 10 feet behind him, I noticed something else. He wasn't moving at all. Not even the small shifts people make when they're sitting. No breathing, no fidgeting. I said hello again, louder this time. He turned his head slowly, just enough for me to see his profile. His skin looked wrong. Pale, almost gray. Like it had been soaked too long. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead, unfocused. He didn't look at me. He didn't blink. I took a step back and apologized, saying I didn't mean to disturb him. That's when he spoke. His voice was low and uneven, like he was struggling to remember how words worked. He asked me what time it was. I told him. He nodded once and said, "It's always later than I think." Then he slid off the dock into the water without a splash. Just down. The lake swallowed him completely. I ran to the edge of the dock and looked into the water, expecting to see bubbles or movement. There was nothing. The surface didn't even ripple. Panic hit me all at once. I shouted for help, scanned the shoreline, but the area was still empty. I ran back toward the parking lot, heart pounding, already pulling my phone out to call 911. That's when I saw the sedan again. Its driver's door was open now. The inside light was on. I approached cautiously, expecting someone to be nearby. The car smelled awful, like stagnant water and rot. On the driver's seat was a pile of wet clothes, a dark jacket and jeans, identical to what the man on the dock had been wearing. I didn't call the police. I know how that sounds, but fear doesn't make you brave. It makes you want distance. I got in my car and left as fast as I could, tires kicking up gravel as I sped back down the road. I didn't look back. For weeks afterward, I tried to forget Hollow Creek Lake. I avoided that highway entirely. Then the dream started. I dreamed I was standing on that dock, looking down at my reflection in the water. In the dreams, my reflection wouldn't move when I did. It would just stare up at me, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Sometimes it would smile. About a month later, I found a local forum online where people talked about fishing spots. Someone mentioned Hollow Creek Lake, asking if it was safe to swim there. The replies were strange, vague warnings, stories about people feeling watched. One comment stood out. It was from an older account, years old. The user wrote that the lake keeps time differently, and that people who stay too long eventually lose track of when they're supposed to leave. I closed the tab and tried to laugh it off. That night, I woke up to the sound of dripping water. It was coming from my bedroom. I sat up and saw wet footprints leading from my door to the foot of my bed. They stopped there. No one was there. I moved apartments shortly after that. New place, new routine. The dreams faded, the fear dulled. Until last year, when I was driving home late and heard a familiar voice on the radio during a local news segment. A man had gone missing near Hollow Creek Reservoir. Witnesses said he'd been sitting on a dock for hours before disappearing into the water. The report mentioned something else too. When police searched the parking lot, they found his car. The driver's door was open. His clothes were on the seat. I turned the radio off and drove the rest of the way home in silence. Sometimes, when I check the time, I think about what that man said, about it always being later than you think. And I wonder how much time I left behind at that lake, waiting for me to come back and sit down. I've gone back and forth for years on whether this even counts as something paranormal, or if it was just the worst coincidence of my life. But the problem is that every logical explanation falls apart the moment I think too hard about the details. This happened in early September, a few years ago, when I was working a temporary job in upstate New York. I was 27, living alone in a rented cabin provided by the company, and most of my work involved surveying land near remote bodies of water. By that point, I was used to isolation. I liked it. What happened at Briar Lake was the first time being alone genuinely scared me. Briar Lake isn't big. It's more like a widened basin surrounded by forest, fed by underground springs instead of visible streams. Locals barely talk about it. When they do, they call it cold water, even in summer. My assignment that day was simple: photograph erosion points along the shoreline and mark coordinates. I arrived just after noon. The weather was perfect, clear sky, no wind, warm enough that I rolled my sleeves up. The lake looked calm, almost inviting, except for one thing I noticed immediately. The waterline was uneven, like the lake had risen and fallen recently, leaving dark, wet marks on the rocks several feet above the current level. I didn't think much of it at the time. Lakes fluctuate. I worked my way clockwise around the shore, taking notes, snapping photos. About an hour in, I started feeling watched, not in a dramatic way. It was subtle, like the sensation you get when someone is standing too close behind you. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just trees and still water. No animals, no insects. I realized then that the woods were quiet, completely quiet. No birds, no bugs, nothing. That's when I checked the time and noticed my watch had stopped. I laughed it off, assuming the battery had died, and pulled my phone out. No signal, which wasn't unusual, but the time on my phone read 11:42 a.m. That didn't make sense. I'd arrived at noon. I remember distinctly checking the time before leaving the cabin. I assumed my phone hadn't updated and kept working. I reached the far side of the lake sometime later and found something that hadn't been on the map. A small wooden rowboat tied to a tree with a thick rope. The boat looked old but usable. Inside were 2 oars and a life jacket, neatly placed like someone had just stepped away. I called out, half expecting someone to answer. No response. I considered leaving, but curiosity got the better of me. I untied the rope and pushed the boat into the water. The moment I stepped in, the lake felt different. The air grew colder, heavy, like pressure building in my ears. I rowed slowly toward the center, water barely resisting the oars. The surface didn't ripple normally. Each stroke seemed to disappear behind me, like the lake was erasing my movement. When I reached what I guessed was the middle, I stopped rowing. The boat drifted to a halt on its own. That's when I noticed something beneath the water. At first, I thought it was a shadow from a cloud, but the sky was clear. The shape was massive and directly under the boat. Not moving, just there. I leaned over the side, squinting, trying to make sense of it. Slowly, details formed. It wasn't a single shape. It was many shapes, overlapping. Pale forms tangled together, all facing upward. Faces, human faces. Eyes open, mouths slack. They weren't floating. They were standing, upright, far below, as if the lake floor dropped away into a deep, vertical space. I pulled back hard, nearly tipping the boat. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it. The water beneath me stirred slightly, and for a brief moment I saw movement. Arms shifting, heads turning, all of them slowly, tilting upward as if they had noticed me. I grabbed the oars and rowed as fast as I could, muscles burning, breath coming in sharp gasps. The shore felt impossibly far away. With every stroke, the air got colder. My hands went numb. Halfway back, something bumped the underside of the boat. Not a gentle nudge. A solid impact. The boat rocked violently. I screamed and nearly dropped an oar. From beneath the surface, I heard a sound, not bubbling, not water. It sounded like muffled shouting, dozens of voices layered on top of each other, distorted by depth and distance. The boat lurched again, then again, like something was pushing up from below. I rowed blindly, not daring to look down again. When the boat finally scraped against the shore, I jumped out into the shallow water and dragged it up onto land. I didn't bother tying it back. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally turned over, I checked my phone again. Still no signal. The time read 11:43 a.m. I drove straight back to the cabin, heart racing the entire way. When I got inside, I collapsed onto the couch, trying to calm down, telling myself I'd imagined it. That's when I noticed my clothes. They were soaked to the knees, ice cold, as if I'd been standing in deep water for a long time. Mud clung to my boots, thick and dark, nothing like the rocky shores I remembered. That night, I finally got a signal. I checked the date. It wasn't the same day. It was 2 days later. I had lost 48 hours. My supervisor called while I was still staring at the screen. He asked why I hadn't checked in and where I'd been. He sounded shaken. Apparently, they'd sent someone to look for me at Briar Lake the previous evening. They found my truck parked near the shore. The engine was cold. My footprints led into the waters and stopped. There were no footprints leading back out. I quit that job the next morning. I moved out of the cabin a week later. I don't go near lakes anymore, not even small ones. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see those faces beneath the water, all staring upward, waiting. And sometimes I wake up with my ears ringing, like pressure changes, and I can almost hear voices calling from far below, angry that I left when so many others didn't.